Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Wenzel. I'm director and chair of the governing board of the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, as well as a professor in English and Comparative Literature and Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of our new series, Climate Change Conversations, Taking Action Against Shock, Silence, and Stupidity. And the first thing that I want to do is offer some thanks. First to our board members, Gisela Winkler of the Climate School and York Schaefer of Lamont Doherty, who's here. I need to thank them for their inspiration and guidance in putting this series together and kind of insisting that we do it. And I'd also like to thank Lindsay Schramm, who's in the wings, but actually central to what's happening, as well as Aaron Fay for their logistical support for the series. So I want to say just a few words about the impetus and rationale for the series as a whole, since this is the first one, and then to introduce our theme and our speakers for the afternoon. The SOF Heyman has been emphasizing climate programming for a number of years with a series on climate futures, climate justice that was organized by our former SOF fellow, Leah Aronofsky, who is here with her students. She's now faculty at the Columbia Climate School. And the series was co-organized with board member York Schaefer. And our new series picks up where that one left off, but in a radically different institutional and political landscape, where the word climate appears with the words race, gender, and other words on a federal list of disfavored terms, where we're told by the federal administration that climate science causes climate anxiety. I'll say that again, climate science causes climate anxiety rather than climate change. And decades of environmental fossil fuel and climate regulation are being rolled back. For us at Columbia, the past 2 years or more, what happens in Washington, D.C. has felt ever closer to what happens in Morningside Heights or at Lamont across the Hudson, with one university president after the next presiding over an institution that to many feels to be in permanent crisis. And yet, in the face of funding cuts and regulatory rollbacks and uncertainty about the direction of our institution, the cascading crises of climate emergency continue and escalate. So as York Schaefer said when we started brainstorming this series, we need to talk about climate change. We need to confront the shocks of the past year, the silence, despair, and fatigue those shocks can create, and the sheer stupidity of much that is happening around us. And I have to say that's kind of a direct quote from York, but I share the sentiments. And one alternative title that we considered for the series was "It's the Climate, Stupid," kind of echoing the 90s campaign slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." In other words, hey, dummies, what voters care about is the economy. But I also heard that phrase "climate stupid" with climate as an adjective modifying stupid. So it's the climate stupidity that we have to reckon with. Two principles guided our organization of the series. First, a desire to draw on the collective intelligence of the university and its varied ways of knowing. In my own scholarship and teaching in environmental and energy humanities, I often insist that there is no one discipline that is best suited to addressing the climate crisis. Rather, it's an all-hands-on-deck moment with a need to think climate across the curriculum and across the university. So this afternoon, we'll consider climate and economy. In March, we'll talk with literary scholars and filmmakers about climate, language, and the imagination. And in April, we'll talk about the relationships between AI and climate change. And we have additional events that we're putting together for the fall. The second principle for the series was that the imperative of talking about climate change means that we should organize a series of conversations with panelists offering and talking through varied perspectives with each other, possibly and probably disagreeing with each other on some things. In other words, the alternative to climate denial, climate stupidity, and climate science is not a simplistic and ineffective lockstep consensus about what is to be done, right? So talking involves actually talking about things that are contested and difficult. So we hope that you leave today's conversation maybe with some answers, but certainly with a better sense of what the questions are, how you might think about them, which ones are simple and which ones are more complex. I also want to acknowledge that this series is part of a year-long commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Society of Fellows, with events on the theme SOF at 50 Humanities in the World. And I think I definitely feel that with this conversation. And in sponsoring the series of conversations about climate change, we continue to realize the vision articulated when the SOF was founded in 1975, that we would engage human problems, such as environmental crisis, that was actually mentioned in our founding documents, by mobilizing humanistic thinking in interdisciplinary partnerships across the schools of the university. To that end, with some trepidation, I, a literature professor, I'm going to moderate this afternoon's conversation on climate and the economy. So let me introduce our speakers today. Matt Huber is professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at Syracuse University. He's the author of two books, Lifeblood, Oil, Freedom, and the Forces of Capital, and Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Climate. Planet, isn't it? Warming planet. Yeah. Gernot Wagner is a climate economist at Columbia Business School and faculty director of the Climate Knowledge Initiative. He's written 6 books, including Climate Shock, and most recently, Geoengineering: The Gamble. His research, writing, and teaching focus on climate risks, technology, and policy. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Times and Financial Times, among other outlets. He holds a Ph.D. and MA in political economy and government from Harvard, and an MA in economics from Stanford. And David Wallace Wells is a columnist and staff writer at the New York Times, where he writes a weekly newsletter on climate change, technology, and the future of the planet. He is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Uninhabitable Earth: Life After Warming, a travelogue of the near future and meditation on how it will look for those living through it. Wallace Wells was previously the deputy editor at New York Magazine, deputy editor of the Paris Review, and a national fellow at the New American Foundation. So the key question that we have put to our panelists today is this: how can we understand climate change as well as shifting policy responses to it as an economic threat, an economic opportunity, or something else? How do the answers to these questions look different at the scale of the region, the nation state, and the globe? And so I've invited the panelists to reflect on these questions for a number of minutes each, and then we'll have some interchange and follow-up questions, and then open up the discussion to the audience. And I think we agreed that we would go alphabetically by last name. So that means that we'll hear first from Matt Huber.
Okay. Slides here. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the invitation and the introduction, and Lindsay for the heroic organizing, which is happening right now. Yeah. There we go. Okay. Perfect. All right. Welcome all. Thanks for coming. I wasn't sure I'd be here because of the weather, but I'm happy to. And I might have been a little, Jennifer asked us to sort of talk about where we're coming from. And I might have been more shy about this in the past, but given I'm in the city of Mayor Mamdani, I will be forthright and say I'm really coming at this question from what I guess you could call the democratic socialist left. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today because, to be honest, I've been thinking for months about how do we understand this moment we're in for climate politics. And let's see if this. Okay. So everyone has been talking about the so-called climate reset or climate realism. But for me, it feels like we're like at the end of something and something has ended. And what I want to argue today is I feel like we're at the end of what I would say is a nearly 20-year period where many on the liberal left believe that climate change could be the kind of galvanizing crisis to stitch together a kind of majoritarian coalition around the kind of economic issue of jobs surrounding the energy transition. And I think this discourse really started with Barack Obama, and the great financial crisis clearly called for a kind of FDR moment. And many in the administration were sort of calling for, green jobs and even a Green New Deal at the time to frame his stimulus package. Then a few years later, I think Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, kind of positioned the climate crisis as the perfect antidote to this kind of neoliberal consensus that had ruled capitalism for decades. And if neoliberalism kind of ceded all economic governance to decentralized markets, it was really bad timing because the climate crisis really called for, above all, kind of coordination, even centralized planning and large-scale public investment, which went against that consensus. But I think the most powerful iteration of this was, of course, in the fall of 2018. The IPCC released its infamous report on what was required to avoid exceeding 1.5 degrees, which feels quaint. And this got taken up spuriously, I would say, by the media, that we had kind of 12 years to avert total catastrophe. We're now down to 4 years, by the way. But weeks after the report, AOC and activists sat in Nancy Pelosi's office brandishing signs saying green jobs for all and calling for this kind of radical vision of a Green New Deal that was rooted in solving the kind of twin crises of inequality and climate change with a kind of massive public investment program, a job guarantee, and broader social benefits like Medicare for all. And to their credit, I think the Green New Deal kind of skyrocketed to be a core issue in the 2020 presidential primary. I don't have time to get into the details, but I think the rollout of the Green New Deal was botched by AOC's office. In the media blitz in February 2019, her office released this truly unhinged FAQ document that unfortunately I think allowed the kind of Fox News wolves to kind of turn the Green New Deal into just yet another culture war where climate activists are trying to take away hamburgers and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And by the time of the 2020 debates, actually, Biden had disavowed the policy. But I think the spirit of the Green New Deal lived on in the Biden administration. At long last, in my opinion, the administration abandoned the party's longstanding commitment to carbon pricing and went all in with this kind of investment focus on industrial policy. Biden infamously called climate change an existential crisis and said it made him think of union jobs as the solution. And it is clear that the administration felt that the Inflation Reduction Act, along with other policies, with investments kind of targeted to red states, would use the green energy investments to kind of win back working class voters, particularly blue collar working class voters that were shifting to the right and shifting to Trump in droves. As we now know, this was a spectacular failure, and the IRA and other laws did lead to a burst of manufacturing construction, but I would argue because they were kind of tax credit financed private investments, I don't think voters really associated these investments with any kind of broad political project. Moreover, a factory opening here and there, employing maybe thousands of workers, was no match for the thing that really concerned millions of working class voters, which of course was inflation and the cost of living. And on that front, Bidenomics really had no answer. In fact, the administration tended to sort of ridicule such pain as a so-called kind of vibe session. And the aggregate data on the economy was good, so the message from the Biden folks seemed to be kind of like, stop complaining. So now to the main argument. Why do I think this dream of tying climate to a Green New Deal-like jobs and investment program is over? Well, I think now we have to confront a basic problem with this theory. The vast majority of voters don't really care about climate change. And a recent Pew survey showed that only 37% of voters really list climate as their top issue. But a recent poll from the Searchlight Institute, it's even more dismal. 6% have it at the top, only 22% have it in the top three. One of my favorite questions on this kind of issue is Yale does these climate opinion maps. And this is the question of whether or not global warming will harm them personally. And only 45% say yes, which means a majority of Americans don't even think climate change is going to actually affect them in any way. And if you look at the map, of course, you can break it down by county, and you see that really the only regions that go over 50% are these sort of islands of cosmopolitan metro blue areas, right? So I think the problem is the climate crisis feels pretty abstract and remote to ordinary working people. And I think a lot of us really believe that the urgency around the climate crisis was only going to become more apparent with time. But so far, I think it's still, unfortunately, largely in the background. And I think this was like most succinctly summed up by the Yellow Vest revolt, where they had this slogan that politicians care about the end of the world, but we're trying to get to the end of the month. And I think that kind of failure of climate politics kind of reach people at the end of month type of level is really the big problem here. And I think still, unfortunately, the climate issue really mostly appeals to highly educated, highly urban voters. And these people are already the base of the Democratic Party. These are not the working class voters that we need to win back, or we need to kind of expand the electorate into. But I want to be clear, obviously, climate change is a crisis, but I think it's more of a kind of slow burn that's not so visible in the everyday. And of course, we've heard about more and more Americans are being displaced by disasters and so forth, but they represent thousands of people in a country of 300. Hey, slow burn. Oh my God. Amazing. So the people displaced by disasters represent thousands in a country of 340 million people. So my sense is for most people, the main threat to their lives is actually not climate, it's ordinary capitalism. Wages are too low, costs are too high. Consequently, making the climate crisis the singular crisis that can spur a kind of monumental Green New Deal-like investment program, it actually is going to require a lot of scientific communication to convince people of that. And we already kind of know that this kind of politics of like believe science and just shouting you must follow the science is not actually going to be that successful in raising the salience of climate as an issue in sort of ordinary working people's minds. So I actually think the left already has a new model for what we might call a post-Green New Deal era. And here I am in New York City. Zohran Mamdani, he actually was or is a radical climate activist. He was, as an assembly member in the legislature, he was doing like sit-ins against fossil fuel infrastructure. He was agitating for the Build Public Renewables Act. But as Robinson Meyer demonstrated during his campaign for mayor, climate change almost never came up, right? Instead, Mamdani pivoted to what people call a laser focus on what polls show is the main issue that voters care about, which is the cost of living, right? Now, I think you can squint and call fast free buses a climate policy, a climate demand, but it's more simply a way to kind of improve working class voters' lives who rely on public transit, right? And I actually think this is, as a wise clan once said, this is the way, right? We need to build power by appealing to the working class's more immediate kind of end of month needs. And I believe that only with this kind of power of mass political appeal, are we going to be able to do anything about the climate crisis anyway, and particularly be able to shape large scale public investment, which I think is at the core of it. So I think it's finally time to admit that invoking the climate crisis itself is not going to really build widespread popular support or power actually itself. And I believe the road to power is a much broader kind of what I would call an anti-austerity agenda that's really focused on expanding public goods in general, things like healthcare, childcare, public transit, and more. But I think it's convenient that a lot of this public goods agenda overlaps with many of the sectors that we actually need to decarbonize, like electricity, transport, housing, which could be folded into a kind of broad public goods agenda. But the real barrier to this public goods agenda is actually not so narrow as the fossil fuel industry. I would say it's the wealthy and capitalist class as a whole, what Bernie and AOC call the oligarchy, right? They have done their part for the last several decades to cut taxes for themselves and impose austerity on the rest of us. And I think beating them and clawing back their wealth for a broad kind of redistributive agenda is not going to be won on the narrow terrain of climate politics. It's going to be a much broader class struggle. And I will stop there. Thank you.
And next we'll hear from Gernot Wagner.
Thank you. And actually, let me put it this way. You turned it around at the end, so now I don't need to spend my 10 minutes immediately talking. But I think, let me start with this. So why am I here, or why I think I'm here? I'm at the business school. I'm an economist at the business school. Okay, so that's the role I'm, I guess, supposed to play here. And then, David can be the reasonable guy in the middle. Okay, so a couple bits. And actually, so I have two things. And actually, this was not intentional, but let me try both a show and tell. And maybe let me start with, is there a first slide potentially? You went back. There we go. Okay. So, so like big picture. And let's talk, Inflation Reduction Act and why it was beautifully named for the long run. Horrible re-election strategy, but right, if fossil inflation is the problem, getting off fossil fuels is the answer, and so on and so forth, right? Let's have this debate and the political debate later, or the New York City debate for that matter, where right, expanding public transit is not climate rah-rah, but New York City, not counting the warehouses in New Jersey that make New York City run, but 70% of our emissions are buildings, 30% are transport. There's this one cow in Central Park in the zoo, right? So that's not a thing around here. So it's those two. And okay, how do we do this? Well, transport means figuring out how to get cars off the road. Congestion pricing is not a Mamdani policy, but yes, that helps. And so do bike paths and free buses and so on and so forth, right? So that's one. And then the second, let's just enforce the law we have, Local Law 97, for those taking notes, to stick to decarbonization goals on the building front. And again, happy to have this debate later and how to get there. And yes, proudly voted for him, despite being a B-School prof. And by the way, I live in a zip code in an area where, was it 80% or so voted for him as opposed to anyone else. And, anyway, again, let's have this debate later. I'm going to make 2 points. And actually, let me do this based on the slides, but also quick show and tell. So climate risks are getting worse faster than most of us appreciate. There's a New York Times bestseller where this came from. I like being introduced as a frequent contributor to the New York Times, and then there's somebody who actually writes for them. So of course, right? We know this. When I say we know this, there is a lot more work to be done. So this is, I'm probably showing you a very recent map produced by a tiny little NGO whose board I sit on, so I have a bit of a stake in this. I was not involved in this personally. This is the very first open, transparent, publicly accessible climate risk map. Right? Some of you might know this. So Zillow, for example, famously put risk index on their website. Briefly, I interviewed their chief economist proudly at the business school like 6 months, 7 months or so ago, where she told us how interesting and amazing this effort is, and it was. Okay, 2 things. One, black box, hard to know how the sausage is made. Open, transparent helps in that. And then second, Zillow might have some advertisers who may not like the fact that there's now a climate risk score staring at you for the sort of, the more expensive properties happen to be the ones closer to the coast, say, that may have greater risks. And yeah, that index is gone. Well, this is very much alive. And well, I encourage you all to check it out, right? So risks are getting worse. Stuff like this is helpful. It's obviously not the whole answer. We need to price these risks. We need to do something about these risks. And okay, so here's the show and tell. And this is sort of the, okay, so here is my own book. But okay, one's called Climate Shock. The other one's called Slow Burn. Friend of mine, by the way, who wrote this a decade later. His argument is that this is wrong.
Mm.
And I happen to agree with both of them. Right? So one is arguing it's the fat-tailed events, it's the unknown unknowns, it's the big thing at the end. Yes, it is. And if anything, this has been proven to be more wrong 10 years later than it was back then when we were accused of catastrophizing because of the title. And now I still, somewhat vain, I still have my Google News alert for climate shock. This is, it's a daily headline these days, not because of the book, but because yeah, we have this front and center people's minds. This argument is it's not the big deal, right? The low probability, high impact event. It is the tiny little that for every 1 day a year above 32 degrees centigrade, 92, 94 or so Fahrenheit, annual payroll, statistically significant, goes down by 0.04%. Annual payroll is affected because one hot day a year, right? That doesn't make headlines typically, but of course these things add up, these productivity declines. Yeah, it's these tiny little cumulative effects that, this is the analogy of the frog in boiling water, which by the way, of course, is incorrect because frogs do jump up, turns out. We are the ones who stay in. And right, that's the real. Okay, so that's one, right? What do we do about it? Okay, so I do have some slides, prof here, and here's the CBS logo on the bottom right. So yes, this is what I also show in my classroom. Things are getting a lot better than most of us appreciate. Much like things are getting a lot worse on the climate risk front. Right, so this is sort of the standard story we all know. Commodities, coal-derived electricity, inflation adjusted, has basically cost about the same for 200 years. Right, this only goes back to 1990, but we could go back much, much longer. Okay, solar PV, famously when fifth to last, right? So when Jimmy Carter put it on the White House roof, 8 panels or so back then, and Reagan took him down 5 years later. Solar PV was 100 times more expensive than it is today. When the Germans started subsidizing, 2005, the conservative chancellor of Germany started subsidizing, 10, 12 times more expensive than it is today. And then there's sort of this story, actually the little kink that goes our way on the batteries front, right? On top of these amazing decreases, lithium-ion, boring old lithium-ion battery, the thing that's in your phone, right? Utility, industrial scale, another minus 50% in costs in the last 14 months by now alone. Solar, wind up to a point, not so much, but still. Solar batteries are technologies. Induction stoves, heat pumps, EVs are technologies. They can only get better and cheaper over time. The rest is commodities. Right? Actually, today, 4th year anniversary, right, of Putin blowing a fuse. Full-scale invasion, Ukraine. Right? European gas prices, 10x. Global US gas prices, 3x. Which again, it justifies the name Inflation Reduction Act 6 months later. And long run, of course that is the answer. Not just get off Russian gas or Russian fuels, but get off fossil fuels for all sorts of complex reasons we can get into merit order pricing in the power sector. That's so. Okay, so what's the answer, right? What do you do with this or with that for that matter, right? As a consequence. So the blue line, California utility scale solar PV. thanks to the other Austro-American you might have heard of. This stuff got deployed very early on. Right? Schwarzenegger signed all the right laws into place. The California Solar Initiative, emissions trading, and so on. And yeah, we pushed some solar PV into the system early on. As of October 24, Texas has more utility scale solar than California, and there's no turning back. Look at these trajectories. By the way, the takeoff happened on the Trump one, at the initial 2016, not because of federal policies, and definitely not because of state level policies. It's the cheapest source of electricity in history. Yes, there's the policy pendulum swinging back and forth, of course. And frankly, the thing I'm most worried about these days is not so much when it will swing back, but if the fulcrum is breaking as we speak. Right, so I do climate. I'm less worried about climate than about democracy. I know too much about German history to be sanguine about that. What policies do we do? What do we take? Actually, here we go. We'll show and tell. I have like 20 more in there, so this might be it now. Climate capitalism. Winning the race to zero emissions and solving the crisis of our age. Akshad Rati, columnist for Bloomberg Green, Ph.D. in chemistry, good guy. I mean, he works for the man. Right? Okay, cool. Anyone heard of this?
Yes.
The Price is Wrong. Why capitalism won't, I figured. I'll put it on your side. Why capitalism won't save the planet. Brett Christophers, Swedish sociologist. That's all I need to say. By the way,
Geographer.
Same thing. Okay, fair enough. Scottish, teaches in Sweden. Fine. He's also an ex-management consultant, by the way, right? Like he spent a year though. So yeah, right? Okay. Now, actually, here's the kicker. They came out on the same day in this country.
Wow.
March 12th, 24. 2 years ago by now. It was a Wednesday. I got them both that day from Amazon, sorry. I could have gone for bookshop.org, but Amazon does deliver the day. I read them both by the end of that first week. They're both right. They are. Of course they are, right? These are like, those 12 stories, blurb by that billionaire whose name we can no longer mention, Uncle Gates. So it's the sort of thing where, right, these entrepreneurs are gonna solve this. Of course, yes, true, they will. Capitalism is a thing, turns out. And the price is wrong. Of course it is. Of course it takes policy. Let me end on this. So yeah, I'm the guy who teaches policy in the business school, climate policy, for example. I'm about to take 25 MBAs on a spring break in Europe, green industrial policy in Europe. We start in Frankfurt, we end in Amsterdam, we go to Düsseldorf and look at a steel plant, ThyssenKrupp. We spend a day and a couple days in Brussels, 3 different commissioners. We end up in Amsterdam. Right? So there's something to learn from those who do green industrial policy. Europe has a lot to learn from others who may or may not be doing it even better. The trick, the goal, the challenge is to figure out how to make both of these, the Mamdani style public procurement policy to purchase the green steel on the one hand, and green steel isn't gonna produce itself. It takes private equity and sovereign wealth funds and well-meaning other Swedish billionaires and so on and so forth to put up the 6 billion euros to produce the first 1 million tons of green steel at some point later this year. That, by the way, is a startup we should actually be watching. But Swedish startups, so it's Spotify, Candy Crush. There is one that has 6.5 billion euros and is working very hard to produce the first 1 million tons of truly green low CO2, zero almost CO2 steel. None of this works without policy. Of course not. It's figuring out the mix. It's figuring out the combination of those two. Thank you.
And now we'll hear from David Wallace Wells.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. I'm going to try to keep this relatively short because we're like crazy long already. And also because both of you have said a lot of things that I had hoped to say. I think the two stories, one sort of political, one policy oriented, as Gernot says, like, both are basically true. I think a feeling of great progress looking at the green energy, the price declines, and a feeling of great despair about the loss of possibility from a few years ago are both completely appropriate. And I spend a lot of time myself trying to think about and make sense of the stories that we're telling ourselves about these dynamics, which are far more complicated than any summary or sort of rallying cry can suggest, but which is really how we nourish ourselves and help ourselves imagine a future. And there, I do think that things seem pretty bleak and grim, especially for someone who was quite invested in a period of great alarm raising and momentum building 6 or 8 years ago. I do think it's important to keep in mind that, it wasn't like 90% of the country was obsessed with climate change in 2018 and now nobody cares about it. Actually, the numbers are pretty stable. We've just had this very dramatic change in top line discourse, which, yes, I'm right for the New York Times. I play a role in shaping that discourse, admittedly, but we frequently get ourselves into trouble, I think, on climate when we, take stock of or read the room in elite circles, interpret the elite discourse and project that onto the public as a whole. I think the public as a whole is not in a very different place than they were 5 or 8 years ago. It's just that they're being failed by their leaders on climate as with so many other things. And on that point, I wanted to talk a little bit more broadly, just briefly, and pick up on something that Matt was talking about at the outset, which is, there was a way that among climate advocates for a period of time, climate served to organize some anti-capitalist feelings or anti-neoliberal feelings. And it seemed logical that this was big enough and universal enough that it called us to feelings of solidarity and compassion and long-term planning, all of which were so sorely lacking in our politics, and that we could kind of, as Naomi Klein suggested, solve a lot of the problems in our political economy if we centered climate change more centrally. And I had that feeling pretty strongly in 2018, 2019, in the era of the Green New Deal moment. And I even had some version of that feeling in 2020 when I saw in the first half of that year an incredible performance of concern by almost everyone in the world for their fellow citizens in the face of a rampaging disease. We did a crazy amount of stuff in that period to protect one another. And it was incredibly solidaristic and global. And, we weren't perfect. We built up resentments, whatever. We imposed disproportionate burdens on certain communities and not on others. But just at the very top line, we were doing something really big and profound in the face of a threat, responding to that threat, in which we were centering the risks to the most vulnerable. And I found that so inspiring. As someone who coming through climate and thinking about the future, I wasn't sure how much that was possible. And the early months of COVID made me think, at least briefly, that it was. And then, that all went away. And I've written a lot about the way that solidarity broke. I've written about the way that the culture has turned from those commitments, becoming more selfish, becoming more self-interested, public health libertarianism, extended more broadly, the idea that other people around us are not even real characters in the video games of our lives, all of these really ugly developments that I think came out of the pandemic experience, and how much people, especially once the vaccines arrived, felt like they didn't need to do much to protect themselves, and therefore they didn't need to worry about protecting other people. But I do think that there's more of that lingering than we tell ourselves, and that appears on the surface. And when I say that, I mean, that in 2008, 2010, 2012, climate advocates who are frustrated with neoliberalism really felt like this was this huge system that nobody in power was questioning and everybody took for granted, and it was going to take something like a revolution to overturn it. And now I look around and everybody's fucking questioning neoliberalism. It's not just a leftist preoccupation. It's like everything from the tariffs to, government taking large stakes in particular companies to, the rhetoric of class warfare that has never really been enacted by Donald Trump, but has been a big part of his public messaging. On the center left, we have all of this envy of China's industrial policy, which is just like would not have been the case for the equivalent people in the Obama era, and is now a really big part of the way that the center left is thinking about, future economic policy design going forward. And we have this huge, looming shadow of economic transformation at the hands of AI, which many people are quite concerned about and thinking through from true fundamentals. Like, what does it mean to have wealth accumulating in a very dramatic way, and power accumulating in a very dramatic way to a small number of people, if we are undertaking a transformative period in our economy and our culture? What constraints do we want our political economy to impose on them? These are all like very profound, deep challenges to what we used to call the neoliberal model. And just one slight point of correction, correction isn't exactly right, but like, I think it's better to think of neoliberalism not as like handing things over to the market, but the period of time in which governments endeavored to promote the interests of capital. And so in a certain way, we may not be living in such a different time than we were in the 90s or the 2000s today. But at the level of discourse, again, at the level of narrative, I think there are many, many big open questions which fundamentally amount to how do we want to organize the future of our society? What protections do we want to demand from each other and from those in power? And what accommodation do we need to make to the turmoil and disruption that we're living through now, versus how much can we impose our own new political economy on that transformation? And I think while we're talking about that these days much more in terms of AI, the same questions are fundamentally true about contemplating our climate future. And I suspect, while we may not be answering them in the "this changes everything" language, we are essentially feeling our way forward to solutions, and possibly new paradigms that will allow us to live in a future ravaged by warming well beyond what we considered acceptable a few years ago. And I think that all of these things together represent, one of the great sociological and political stories of our time, which is being undertaken at all levels of our society, in which we are blind to if we think we can just tell the story of the climate future or the political future by looking at, declining cost curves heading forward. So hopefully that's a narrative synthesis or addition to these points, and we can take it from there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I suppose what I hear across these contributions is actually it is the economy stupid, and how to think about climate concerns in relation to concerns about affordability, concerns about billionaires. I mean, as you were talking, David, I was thinking about billionaires and AI data centers and increasing just weird and intense storms as the places, I think, where those ordinary folks beyond the elite kind of might come in contact with these questions. And so I guess I would ask a follow-up question to the three of you. First of all, I mean, you've been responding to each other already, but if there are things that you want to add, and in responding to each other, that's fantastic. But I'm also interested in kind of drilling down a little bit more in what you think about the relationship between the economic and climate politics, right? I mean, I think that's implicit, Gernot, in what you're saying about these, the falling prices of renewables and yet the challenge of the policy landscape. And I think that, David, what you're talking about is politics in a broader sense of how do we decide together what kind of life we want, right? And so, yeah, I mean, maybe it's clear what I'm asking.
Well, I mean, one way of maybe talking about it is to say that, over this period of time of the last couple of years, we've seen a turn from talking about climate issues and energy issues in this global context to talking about it almost exclusively, or hearing politicians talking about it, I should say, almost exclusively in terms of affordability and prices. And there is some political wisdom to that, in the sense that both of you guys were talking about. But it also feels like a very narrow band with which to talk about what politics are for. And I do think ultimately, I mean, we'll see how things go over the next year into the midterms and a couple years into the presidential election, but it doesn't seem to me like we have big answers to the question of affordability. Actually, people like talking about the affordability crisis, like they have little fixes here and there, but there's little that inspires larger visions of a sort of post-scarcity future, or a post-inflation crisis future even. And it does seem to me like that there's something missing both at the level of intellectual consistency there, but also at the level of political appeal, that we don't just want to know that like there's going to be a price cap that limits the price of strawberries from going up too much. We want to believe that the system as a whole is working to include more people, and give them a sense of the future, which they have over the last couple of decades kind of systematically lost. And so, that particular question of like, do we talk about the economic impacts of climate change and where a truly, urgently taken green transition can lead us? Or do we talk about affordability, by which we mean we're going to tweak some things to lower your electricity bills? I think that's one way of sort of putting the question, passing the buck down the battle to you guys.
If I could just sort of respond in general to I know we're supposed to maybe debate a little, but like I actually get frustrated with the cost curve graphs and the kind of heroic story of cheap.
There's your debate.
Because to me, like electricity is not like toasters. It's not a commodity that you produce where it has that kind of similar cost grade. It's an infrastructure. It's a socialized infrastructure that has to be, as we know, balanced with supply and demand. It's like you need all this kind of infrastructure to kind of keep it running. And I think when we look at like the failure of us to decarbonize our electricity system, it's not because solar and wind are incredibly cheap. I mean, like that's helping, but it's the real problem is like we don't know how to like actually build transmission lines to connect it. We're not building enough new generation. There's a lot of building of infrastructure, like socialized shared infrastructure. If I mean, we don't need to get too wonky, but if you look into like the interconnection queue, it's like very much like who's going to pay for this like social infrastructure, right?
Of course. So
yeah, so
sure.
So like I think we have to think about electricity as a kind of like a public infrastructure that we invest in sort of through sort of socialized investment models. And that those cost curves kind of, I think, lull us into thinking that, ordinary capitalism can kind of solve it, right? And yeah, I had many other thoughts, but I'll let you just
actually, okay, so let me that's the danger. It truly is. And of course, right, it takes public investment massive, massive, massive public investment. And grids is sort of the stereotypical example. I think here's sort of one thing that sort of has come up implicitly, but actually not quite directly. We also need to realize that we are literally up here against the world's most profitable ever sector, the extractive, right? Oil, coal. Like, what is it? Aramco made what, $35 billion in raw profits last quarter. And that is, sort of after paying for the Saudi state and sort of after, a few other things sort of that get subtracted along the way. And just to like some of the conversations we are having, right? Sort of the language of what we are like, okay, why do we call this thing natural gas? Because somebody wants us to. Because somebody spent hundreds of millions of dollars teaching us that it's natural gas, not just gas or not fossil gas or, God forbid, methane gas or whatever else. And in some sense, okay, so this is maybe part of the sort of the Obama era climate policy food fight came up before. That was sort of my own personal experience. So I worked for EDF at the time, Environmental Defense Fund. The Enviro movement in general spent hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying pro. We were outspent 10 to 1. And it was not because the other side didn't have money for 11 to 1, because that's what was needed to kill it. Right? And yes, this is part of these. So the fact that, solar panels are getting so cheap that Germans are installing them as garden fences? Just to give you, like, this is not how you put a solar panel. It's not. But it keeps the dog in and the car charged and it doesn't take up space and it's almost as cheap as wood. Might as well. Right? And by the way, so here's sort of the capital. So world's largest solar producer as of 3 years ago, LONGi, Chinese company. That 15 years old, 12 years old, right? Help climb the learning curve, slide down the cost curve. One of the big ones, right? One of the Jia Solar is the other big one, and a couple others. LONGi lost 80% in market cap, to speak in very capitalistic terms, like stock price, stock market value, and laid off. They were at 80,000 employees at their height. They are now down to like 37,000. None of this says anything about solar panels as a technology. Again, cheap enough for garden fence. It means they're so cheap that they're commodities. You can't make money off them. LONGi 3 years ago founded LONGi Hydrogen. And are now basically, with the help of the state and subsidies and so on, basically in some sense, in sort of trying to do for electrolyzers, for green hydrogen, what they did for panels 15 years, 12 years prior, and what CATL and others did for batteries, the 5-year plan in between. So is this, capitalism rah-rah will solve it? No, of course not. But, okay, should we celebrate the fact that, by the way, those prices are never going to go up again? Right? And by the way, so speaking of fossil power, right? The fact that we have these very earnest conversations about critical minerals, transition minerals, and so on, and the environmental consequences of, have you thought about the poor Bolivians who are now going to die in our lithium mines, or the poor Chileans who are going to suffer because of copper production? Of course, there are problems being created, and it would be good to nip them in the bud. The material footprint of the entire decarbonized, glorious, zero carbon, low carbon, high efficiency economy is 3 or 4 orders of magnitude the material footprint of the fossil economy we have. Are there small? Yes, of course. Slavery is bad, for the record, of course. But order of magnitude problem, like 3 or 4 orders of magnitude less. The fact that, earnest scientists are earnestly studying this topic, generously funded by certain self-interested entities, of course, that is a creation of the world's most profitable industry, printing another 35 billion for another quarter.
Just a quick point though, like if you go to Texas and California, when the sun goes down and those solar panels go down, they fire up the fossil gas to keep the grid going, you know? So these things are like complementary in our grids because it's
They are.
infrastructure.
And
you know?
4 years ago, your story was true for California. It was literally when the sun went down and Californians went home.
Yeah,
What
but
was the
the
difference?
batteries are.
It was natural gas and imports, and the imports were natural gas if they were not coal.
Yeah.
Between 4 years ago and this year, a third of that peak, when Californians come home when the sun is down, is now lithium-ion batteries. A third of that. 4 years. Right? Okay. Therefore, solved? No. Or therefore capitalism will? No, of course not. And by the way, the energy market is the least free market we have, sort of big scale. Right? So of course it's all about rules, regulations, and so on. But should we celebrate that batteries are cheap and getting cheaper and doing it with less footprint than the fossil economy? Yes.
But isn't what Matt said to start a response to everything that you've just said, which is that, yeah, I mean, if we treated this more as a public infrastructure, which had public benefits and didn't hand the job of the transition over to profit interests, we'd probably be in a better spot.
Capitalism sucks for all sorts of reasons, of course. Yes, says the business school prof. And just okay, sorry. So I sometimes say this in public talks. Sometimes I regret saying my wife's an abortion doc. We have real problems. And of course, and on the climate front is more public investment. By the way, there are certain countries who the other EDF, not Environmental Defense Fund, but Electricité de France, basically nationalized. And okay, why? Because in August 22, they went bankrupt, or would have gone bankrupt. And they're responsible for, 70% of French electricity is nuclear power. That's them. And of course, right, the French state is not going to let the grid go dark or the main company go bankrupt. Their solution, nationalization. Is that part? Yes, it is. Okay, should we therefore basically, earnestly write books about let's solve this by nationalizing the Texas energy sector as the solution to climate change because capitalism does suck? I'm not so sure. Fixing capitalism first is a solution to that.
I mean, I know that we're supposed to be here talking about capitalism, but I'm not even talking about it in terms of capitalism. I mean, when I think about the fracking revolution, this is a business that transformed the American energy sector without turning a profit for 12 years or whatever, and only very briefly has turned profits. Sure. Or I think about the AI boom, where we're like, we don't even know where this money, if this money is going to ever pay us back, and yet we're dumping tons of money into it. Yep. Is that capitalism? In some sense, yes. In some sense, no. Sure. I just mean I think it's useful to think a little bit more broadly and do what we can to design systems that allow allow investment without such relentless and short-term focus on profits. And what's interesting to me about those two examples is that they have unfolded in the American contexts with some relatively right-wing energy and support, even though they are hugely speculative, essentially investments in what we imagine might have future public payoffs as opposed to generating enormous profits in the short run.
Sure. And so, I mean, are we still debating capital? So
you feel free.
Is this then okay? So is fracking for gas part of the answer? Actually, so here's one of these sort of massive misconceptions. That clearing that up might actually help us elevate the conversation, right? So one of the stories told to us through prominent media, present company excluded, is that us fracking for gas decreased emissions in this country enormously, and therefore it is unmitigated success. I think the unmitigated part is correct on the methane emissions. Success, yeah. So a third of the decrease from the 2005 height in U.S. emissions, both absolute and per capita, was the switch from coal to gas. And as long as there's not enough, not too much leakage, that's good. A third of that decrease, efficiency. megawatts, right? Not using, being better at, wasting less, which last time I checked was good from a very capitalistic perspective. And the other third, even starting in 2005, was renewables, was the rapid deployment of low carbon technologies, right? So did coal to gas switch play a role? Yes, it did. Should we have accounted fully for fugitive methane and therefore some of those positive steps actually were steps backwards, at least partially? Yes, that's true too. But actually the real story is even back then, even starting in 2005, when solar was 10 times more expensive than it is today, a third of that decrease from our peak was thanks to renewables. Capitalism, rah-rah? No, but right, technology is getting better. Yes, of course, that's part of the answer.
Yeah, crowd. So.
Yeah, I think it's a great time. I think it's a great time to open up the conversation to the audience. I have many, many questions I would love to ask, but yeah, Leah, I think we have, yeah, you'll take my mic.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh,
Yeah. Leah. Thank you. I have two questions. The first is mostly for Matt. Thank you all. It's been a while since I've heard such a good conversation around climate. So thanks. So Matt, I wonder, hearing you narrate this history from the Green New Deal moment to the sort of turn to anti-austerity, why do you think it took so long for the movement to think about the affordability crisis? Like, why is it because there was such sort of energy around organizing a mass movement against fossil capital, and therefore that's sort of the sort of wonky translation of that becomes the green jobs sort of turn, and therefore you're sort of on that path. But it seems to me so apparent that the Mamdani framing, which actually I guess you must be right that it's implicit, but to me his argument about making New York City affordable as good climate policy, of course, right? Because then you're ensuring that people don't have to flee for the suburbs where it's cheaper, but you need a car and blah, blah, blah. You've written a whole book about this. So I don't need to tell you that, but that seems so compelling to me. And, you have the Geoengineering, so many sort of on the ground actors saying this is about affordability, and why isn't the climate movement taking that seriously? So can you help me wrap my head around that question that I have been sort of puzzling around myself? The other question is about the sort of moment we're in, and the sort of retreat from apocalypticism that seems to be going on, whether sort of bad faith Trump moment or the sort of Bill Gates retreat and the ESG retreat. And so it seems like apocalypticism is no longer sort of an organizing logic for climate action. And so I wonder if any of you have thoughts about what comes after. Like this slow burn concept seems much more about climate in the here and now, right? The actually existing climate change that we're experiencing, rather than some kind of future shock. So I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Can I answer that? Okay. Well, the short answer to why it took so long, I actually think this massive inflationary crisis of 22, 23 was kind of that's why they called it the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think that did raise affordability to this new kind of salience. We have to be clear that this neoliberal, in addition, I agree, it is about empowering capital over this but it's also about this relentless focus on keeping inflation down since the Volcker shock of 1979. And they succeeded until this moment, right? And so inflation became this big thing. What I've been thinking a lot about lately is that, from the Obama moment through the Green New Deal moment, there was a sense that actually the New Deal took place in the context of the Depression, right? This massive crisis of unemployment, right? And when you go back to 2018, 2019, and the kind of architects of the Green New Deal idea, they actually said like this policy really will only make sense when the next recession hits, right? The next crisis. And but what happened was that next crisis, which David talked about, was the COVID recession, which was not your everyday. It wasn't like the 1930s depression. It was this very strange kind of shutdown, as Tooze called it, right? And then right after the pandemic, it was this very like unemployment went way down. It was a like tight labor market. You know, the essential workers we all celebrated now become no one wants to work again. This kind of like selfish resentment politics. And so we actually have not, since Obama, who I blame a lot for this, since Obama, we have not had this like cataclysmic financial crisis, which the AI bubble might create for us. But that is what the Green New Deal people were saying, like, that's the kind of crisis where we can have, like, that's the kind of crisis where a job guarantee makes sense when you have mass unemployment, which we, you know, still today, unemployment's like 4% something, you know, it's still pretty tight. So that's what I think we are on that. In terms of the apocalyptic.
Can I say one thing about the other? I
Yeah.
think it's important, like, money was free during that entire period.
Yeah.
And so from a
Yeah.
policymaking and an advocacy point of view,
Yeah.
we were thinking less about trade-offs. It's just a background fact of this whole period that like interest rates were at zero or in some cases even below zero. And that I think really shaped a lot of thinking in the 2010s in ways that we almost forget now because it's never going to be that way again. Or not for a very long time.
Yeah, just quickly on the apocalyptic, I've been thinking a lot about that because I sort of coming to grips with, I think the larger majority of people just don't believe that it's an apocalyptic, right? And that is the kind of slow burn thing, which I think, you know, this idea that's like every 10th of a degree matters and it's getting worse and worse, but it's not an apocalypse yet, right? But I think what really freaks me out is that you got to look at the science on tipping points and all these things that could very rapidly change things. And if that were to happen, I think it would totally, you know, we'd be talking about a much different economic situation. I mean, it would be agricultural collapse and things like this. So it would be the center of everything. But until that kind of cataclysmic tipping point, like the AMOC, whatever it's called, until something like that happens, it's kind of like it's bad. It's getting worse, but it's not in the front of mind for most people who are just trying to get to the end of the month. So
I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, it's, you know, I wrote a somewhat apocalyptic book about climate and, you know, and have watched these debates very closely. But one thing I would just say from a bigger picture perspective is that I don't think our culture has left apocalypticism behind at all. I think we've moved on from climate. But we freaked out about COVID. We freaked out about AI. We're freaked out about fertility crisis. You know, there's like a lot of shit that people are freaking out about in very apocalyptic terms. And the way that I see it is more like, you know, there's something going on where we are needing to freak out about truly dramatic transformations ahead of us. And we sit with something for 6 months or 9 months as a culture. We run through that, we use it up in whatever way we need, and then we move on to the next thing. And climate was like the first of those really to hit. But it's not because the world is now, everybody thinks everything's going to be great. Our democracy crisis, you know, it's like, and the question is whether having passed through that phase of panic, climate can regain the attention of the world on a different footing or not. And, you know, at some point, I probably shared some version of the thoughts that you just shared, Matt, in the sense of not about tipping points exactly, but, you know, like a lot of people in climate, you think, well, when things are going to get really bad, people are going to pay attention. But I actually don't really know that that's the case and don't know how confident we can be about that. And I think about, in particular, the LA fires, which, you know, complicated story, not narrowly climate, but nevertheless, literally illustrated what people like you go out, you have a climate nightmare. What is your climate nightmare? It's like your house getting burned down overnight and the whole community being destroyed. And 6 years ago, 3 years ago, we would have said like, wow, if a rich neighborhood in the world's global capital of culture, full of famous people with huge social media followings, had their entire community burned down in a single night. That's what's that? Yeah, well, January's a little, yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's certainly which used to be thought of, yeah, well, it's changing, but yeah,
Which is part of the
all of that's true. If that had happened, we would have thought, oh my God, everything's going to wake up, everybody's going to wake up. But the truth is, like, Katrina didn't really wake us up, and the LA fires haven't really woken us up either. And I think that we're probably going to accommodate ourselves to a future of more and more disasters, not ever by waking up, but by defining our standards, in such a way that we allow for higher and higher losses. And yeah.
Yes, and okay, so New York City, Sandy was what, 13 years ago by now, I think. 12 plus, so yeah. Right, so okay, no, I mean, because we shut down Wall Street for climate reasons, right? Did that sort of solve it once and for all? No. But okay, are we spending low double-digit billions of dollars on resiliency measures in the city as a result? Yes, okay, has that taken too long? That too. But right, so is there gonna be, are we gonna wait for this one climate shock that will finally do it all? No. But well, okay, ask homeowners in California or those wanting to purchase homes these days what they think about California's largest home insurer no longer insuring homes in California because of wildfires, or the equivalent in Florida no longer doing so because of hurricanes, right? So is that the sort of, oh my God, finally we will all wake up and do sort of a COVID style, right? Save 500 million people from infections because we shut it all down? No. And by the way, shutting it all down isn't going to be the climate solution anyways. We need to build, right? For example. Yeah, that said, okay, what can we use some of this momentum? Because actually you just said something sort of different, David, before, right? So you said, actually, in response to Matt, it's not like that climate was the issue. Obama era climate policy push. It wasn't like that, during Waxman market days, it was, everyone thought that this was the top issue. No, that number has been fairly stable.
Yeah, and not during the hurricane period either.
Yeah. And so the question is, right, when, actually, this is sort of an Obama era thing. Him being interviewed by Jerry Seinfeld. Anyone remembers this? It's like, striding in cars with comedians having coffee or whatever. So it turns out he couldn't, take him on a joyride, but that was in the White House cafeteria. So what's politics to you? It's like American football. Right? You get ready, and there are lots of passes, failed passes, lots of misses, and then every once in a while, because you've gotten ready all along, right? You hit the not home run, that's a different sport, but yeah, you see where this is going. I know my soccer analogies better than this.
I think he said about like everybody wants a touchdown, but sometimes you get just a first down.
Yes, right, and you go for these wins, right, and you got to get ready, and every once in a while yeah, the climate movement, right, isn't gonna have this one big global win, but okay, China has a cap and trade system. China is pricing carbon. Now it's like $15, $12. Is that enough? No. Okay, what is it? March 15th, right? 3 weeks, next 5-year plan. NDOC isn't going to save the world. And RDC, the Enviro Group, has something to do, and DOC has something to do, the National Development Reform Commission in Beijing, right? Are they going to do it once and for all? No, but are these things adding? Of course. Is it also because China is a ruthless capitalistic economy from certain perspectives? That contributes? Is it top-down state-sponsored socialism? Of course. That is part of the equation. And it's, we've got to take the wins where we get them and push for more and hopefully stick it to the man, if the man is the fossil fuel industry, every chance we get.
here.
You. Because this is a humanities space, I'm going to make a statement first, and then I'll ask a question. I just would really like to encourage everybody to think about the difference between the campaign for the 2020 election and the focus on climate, and then how Biden governed, and not take his loss in 2024 as a referendum on people's positions about climate change. So I feel like a lot of this searchlight heat map discourse is conflating the results of the 2020 election and Biden's governance, which was by all measures rather disastrous, at least in its public forms, in its communication, in its capacity for understanding that people were suffering from affordability shocks, in its support for the genocide in Gaza. So there's a way in which the entire Biden administration is getting conflated with the 2020 election, and it's being taken as a referendum on how people feel about climate. But I do think David is actually quite right that people are pretty much about as alarmed about it now as they were in 2019. So that's my statement. Now, my question is, I would love to hear the three of you say a little something about authoritarianism. It's something that hasn't actually come up in this conversation yet, and I find that very surprising because it seems to be a political form rising in the West that's inflecting these more sort of clear market signals about prices. It seems clear that Donald Trump is doing illegal things to intervene in markets in a way that helps the fossil fuel industry. And I wonder if there's a story to tell about the past years and the future that needs to take into account the assets that might be stranded if we successfully decarbonized our economies. Like, I'm wondering if Overshoot is in your bag by any chance. It's a really fantastic book, and I recommend it so highly. It's it's by Wim Carton and Andres Malm. And it's the first of a two-part series on the sort of technologies that justify the overshoot of 1.5 degrees Celsius, including integrated assessment models, carbon dioxide removal, and solar geoengineering. But the real core of the book, and the thing that absolutely rocked my world, was the account of how much extant capital would be stranded if we actually did phase out fossil fuels, and not just, that capital, but how that stranding would send waves of devaluation into equities, into the credit markets, potentially creating financial shocks that made 2008 look like a cough. So it seems to me that there is a story possibly to tell that people were actually serious about climate action in the wake of the SR 1.5 report, but then realized soon that this was a threat to global capitalism because it not only threatened kind of the way the world financial system is structured, but sort of this foundation of private property, which is to say that if you claim you own reserves, why shouldn't you be allowed to burn them, to extract them, sell them, and have people burn them? Like, what political mechanism is there that would intervene and say, no, we are suspending right to property in order to try to save the world? And isn't it the case that authoritarianism has risen in response to that gap, that refusal to look at these stranded assets and understand how they're intersecting with the sort of price system that we have now? So that's my question. I'd like to hear it from the three of you.
Question of authoritarianism, the thing that my mind goes to first is just that, when I was first really reading about climate science 10 years ago, one of the more striking things that I found myself following was the thread of research documenting the ways in which higher warming levels would lead to right-wing politics. And often through the mechanism of mass migration, but also because many more people would feel pinched and left out of a society that they didn't believe was engaged in positive sum progress, but engaged in something much more like, zero-sum competition. And we're living through that now. There's a lot else that's going on. And you're talking about something that's a little bit more like top-down authoritarianism from forces of capital and their friends in politics. But there's also something going on at the grassroots level, which is just that people are responding to a sense of fear and anxiety that is in part climate powered. And the scary thing about that is that that driver's not going away. It's going to intensify. Um, I actually think that this sort of conventional narrative about the rightward march of all the world's liberal democracies is like a little overstated. I do think that there are plenty of bright spots which don't get as much attention as the things we're really scared about. And I do think it's sort of more of a mixed picture than a harrowing fascist frog march or whatever. But I live in the real world too, and I'm also scared of those things. So I'll leave it to Gernot to talk a little bit more about the way that intersects with economic politics. But I would just say, to connect the two thoughts, it doesn't seem to me a coincidence that we have elected a dog-eat-dog tribalist leader whose main job, especially in this term more than the first term, he sees his main job as helping out his friends in a world in which profits are harder and harder to find. And that's not just true of the fossil fuel industry, that's sort of across the board. But if we're taking seriously the deeper psychological effects of what it means to live and make sense of a world that's hotter and hotter and full of more disarray, that is one logical response, however offensive it might be to us politically.
Yes to everything you just said. So we know about the fossil meeting in Mar-a-Lago where he sort of promised, right, give me $1 billion and I will make you more than whole in exchange if you help me get elected.
And they only gave him 500 million, and he still
made it, yeah, somehow. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of be optimistic, right? On top of that, but so let me try playing my B school prof role here. I mentioned Aramco before, right? $35 billion last quarter, raw profit. Saudi Aramco has a net zero goal. Not all in downstream, right? They don't care that we are burning their fossil. I mean, they do care that we buy it and then burn it. They don't care what the social cost of carbon is associated with these emissions. It's net zero in operations. Okay, and we can all agree that, without naming specific names, but some fossil companies out there are clearly the bad guys. Okay. What's the one country out there that sort of has figured it all out? Yes, it's up there. And yes, it's fossil company, DONG, right? Danish oil natural gas, now called Ørsted, transformed itself from 80% fossil fuels to 80% wind and basically 100% renewables, 100% low carbon. And that's amazing. And then it bet big on the US and it lost, right? So there's other things happening here too. I would have said Norway as one of them. That, what is it, 97+% of newly registered vehicles last year, electric. And there's like 5 million of them, right? Tiny little country. And yes, attached to the world's largest sovereign wealth fund and so on. Okay. And what do we can have the Norway-Denmark debate and so on all day long. And Sweden figures into this too. And I'm sure Finland has some role to play. But they are part of the good guys. Norway, of course, finances its transition through a company now no longer called Statoil, but okay, the entire country basically has a net zero strategy that is, yes, more ambitious than Saudi Aramco's, just to say it out loud. The difference is 10 years. Aramco says 2060, Norway says 2050. One are the good guys and the other one are clearly not. And by the way, actually, the last one on this, so Shell Oil, and yeah, there are some things happening on the corporate front now. Shell scenario planning, famous, infamous, decades-long history of predicting Greta before Greta was born, right? These sorts of things, literally, right? Like late 1990s, what's the biggest thing that could happen? The worst thing? It is a youth-led climate uprising that will lead for the fossil fuel industry to go the same way as tobacco by 2020, right? And yes, in comes Greta. Okay, Shell, the latest scenario, the worst case for them. Actually, sorry, the worst case for us, the sort of best case for them, if you will, for the fossil sector, has the entire world fully decarbonized by the end of the century. 2100, which is way too late for all sorts of reasons, right? And so on. I can go through a bunch of books there. So it is. That's 50 years. That's 40 years after Aramco says they would do whatever they are doing, which, by the way, is somewhat believable, because why burn their own oil if they can make money selling it to us, and they're about as best positioned as you can be, printing money from harvesting photons as opposed to their own oil. None of this is if. It is when. And it takes massive, massive push on the policy front, and so on and so forth. But what is allowing Statoil on the one hand, Aramco on the other, or any of these other companies or countries to go the way they're going? Induction stoves were $5,000 10 years ago. They're like the unaffordable thing. IKEA sells an induction plate for $50 these days. IKEA, right? It used to be the cheapest thing you can do, the contractor grade way to heat up your Chinese food or boil your water in a New York City rental was a $300 gas stove. That was the cheapest thing you can do. The cheapest thing now is a $50 IKEA induction plate. And by the way, it's the same technology that you see in the highest of high-end homes. No, these cost curves alone are not going to save us. Betting against is certainly not a winning strategy. And is this one of these underlying forces that, no, not capitalism rah, not solve itself on its own, but is this part of what we ought to embrace as a climate movement to channel these things in the right direction? Heck yes.
Just quickly, yeah, I agree with you completely that Biden's governance was disastrous. Particularly, I don't think there was really a lot of effort to brand the investments in the IRA, like create a kind of political vision behind them that would really inspire people. In the way that I get nostalgic about, like FDR put his face on all these New Deal type investments but also to your other point, I really think there was as much as it was a real shift from this kind of neoliberal carbon pricing consensus to this kind of industrial policy, it was still a very like market-friendly program of tax credits for private investors and not only investors but also private consumers. It's just like we'll just like put nudges out for the market and then we'll just wash our hands, right? And that's, again, not a very inspiring kind of galvanizing political. And so this vision of all carrots, no sticks, really, to your point, like there was no vision of like we have to confront the power of not just a fossil fuel in their infrastructure and we have to devalue their capital, but also, like I said in the talk, like we actually need a much more like wildly redistributive political economy that taxes the rich at much higher levels to create the resources for these kind of larger public goods that are going to be, and that was not on the cards at all. And so that's why I do appreciate the Bernie Sanders type of politics, because it is confrontational. It's like we have to take on them, the billionaire class, to make life better for us, right? We have to, and people, I think we know from the politics now, people are angry. They want to get angry at something. and that Bernie style politics gives you a class enemy to organize around. And I think that can include getting angry at the fossil fuel companies, but also just the oligarchy, right? So that's kind of what we need. And again, this Biden, this catastrophic governance of his, it led to the authoritarian moment, but we have to remember that this authoritarian won the popular vote. To govern that badly where you allow that guy to win the popular vote is really, to me, just horrific and just horrible. So I'll just stop there.
Can I do make a couple perverse statements in defense of Joe Biden's governing? I mean, I was not a enormous fan of the IRA, although I cheered its passage. It was not my preferred structure, but I was happy to see it passed into law. And I do think it's important to keep in mind two things about it. The first is that it was passed into law, and it was by far the biggest thing that, had ever been achieved by American policy on climate. And that, as you say, huge black mark on Joe Biden to allow the return of Donald Trump and to govern in a way that made that possible. But it wasn't so far from the outcome going in the other direction. The IRA didn't produce a huge political backlash that made people angry and they were racing to the polls to vote against it. It was in the background. It didn't mobilize a huge base of support. But the alternate history in which, Biden is more available as a candidate, more visible as a president. Kamala's more whatever, and she barely gets over the finish line, and the IRA really gets locked in. That wasn't so far from where we landed. And while if I were going back in time, I would design things a little bit differently. It doesn't seem to me that that particular set of policy choices around climate is so transparently disastrous or the primary reason why we are where we are. Now, maybe it means that the next time we have a chance to design climate policy, it can be more inclusive and more focused on public goods. I hope so. But I think on some level, in a weird way, the IRA, while being almost entirely undone, is also kind of like an amazing political achievement. And I'm still kind of impressed that they got it over the finish line.
Thank you for saying that, because when you said, Matt, that the IRA was a spectacular failure, I wanted to say, wait a minute. So I am afraid that our panelists have so well taken up the invitation to be in conversation with each other that we have just about run ourselves out of time, and we actually have to get out of the building. So I mean, what I'm taking from this, among other things, is just the question of what stories that we tell ourselves about the present and the future. And what stories do graphs and charts tell, whether of tipping points or inflection points, and also the recognition that some stories have more power and money behind them than others, and so how to mobilize the stories without the power and the money. So I feel terrible because I did make promises to two people about questions, but I think we also just I would invite you maybe to ask your questions very quickly to the panelists as they are trying to get out of the building. But thank you so much to the panelists, and thank all of you for coming. This has been really wonderful.